Hey, welcome back everyone. In this video, we'll start to look at manipulating objects, but before we get too far into that, I want to take a few moments to talk about the camera controls and also about a few settings you can use to help set up the viewing window for development. So for the camera, pretty much everything's done with the middle mouse button. So if I hold down the middle mouse button and drag the mouse around, you can see it rotates around the object. If I hold down the shift button and then hold down the middle mouse button and move it around, you can see that it pans the camera. And this is especially useful if you have like a model that extends out along one of the axes. You may have to use that quite a bit, especially if you're doing detail work or something, to make sure that you stay in center of frame and makes things a little bit easier for you. And then, as you've already seen me do a couple of times now, scrolling the middle mouse wheel zooms in and out. And so, since the middle mouse button is pretty much all camera controls, the left mouse button is used to select things. So for instance, if I wanted to select this camera, you left click it. You'll notice it turns green or whatever your highlight color is for your theme. And then same thing if I click the cube again, turns green. Click the light up here, it turns green. So just pay attention to whatever is your selection color and that'll be the object you're working with. And then the right mouse button is used to bring up menus, and don't worry about the menus for now. We'll go through the different menu options that we need as we need them. Again, I don't want to overload you guys too early. In my experiences, the key to learning is to kind of digest things in small bites. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about some of the keyboard shortcuts for the camera. So if you press 1 on the numpad, then you get a front view. If you press 3 on the numpad, you get a side view. And if you push 7, you get a top view. Now, if you want to flip that, so like right now I've got a top view. If I wanted to look at the bottom, there are a couple of ways you can do that. So you can either press 9 on the numpad, or if you use control in combination with 1, 3, or 7, it'll reverse that. So 7 gives me the top view, and if I hold down control and press 7, then it gives me the bottom view. Likewise, 1 gives me front, and control 1 gives me back, and then 3 gives me right, control 3 gives me left. So pretty simple. 5 on the numpad, it's kind of hard to see from this angle, so I'll kind of rotate up and press it again. You'll notice the cube changes a little bit. What that's doing is that's shifting between perspective and orthographic view, and orthographic is just a fancy word meaning things seem less distorted when they're far away from the camera. So again, if you have something that extends out way along the axis that's aligned with the camera, and you're having a really hard time telling whether things are lined up with the front of it, you might try checking right here to see if you're in orthographic or perspective, and if you're in perspective, try switching to orthographic. Couple more keys. So 0 gives you your camera view. So right now my camera is right here, and so this is showing exactly what the camera sees, and that's really useful. So if I render really quick, and render is kind of like taking a snapshot of whatever is on the screen. So it's literally like taking your camera and taking a picture. You'll notice that this matches fairly well. Let me close this for a sec and press 0 again, and then do that again. You'll notice that the render screen matches fairly well what you see on the camera window. So again, not useful right now because all we have is a gray cube, but as we start talking about materials and rendering and everything, that'll get much, much more useful. And then the last 4 keys on the numpad kind of act as incremental rotation, so that's 4, 6, 8, and 2. And typically these have arrows printed on them to kind of show you what direction things are going to move in. It's a little counterintuitive. It moves the opposite of whatever arrow is printed on your key, inverted directions. So 4 will rotate you counterclockwise, 6 will rotate you clockwise, 8 rotates down, and 2 rotates up. I don't use those too often. I normally just stick with the middle mouse wheel, but if you are doing something and just need to rotate a bit or don't feel like stretching your hand over to the mouse, that could definitely be useful. And so there are just a couple of things I want to talk about before we start actually manipulating objects. One is the wireframe view. If you hold down the Z button, you get this nice little radial menu, and don't worry about the rendered or the material preview for now. For now, all we're really concerned with is solid and wireframe, and right now we're in solid, meaning that it is actually rendering all the surfaces. If you switch to wireframe, and you switch just by hovering over wireframe and then letting off the Z, you'll notice that it's now only highlighting the edges. And so again, with only our cube on the field, this doesn't really appear that useful, but if you had like a mug or something, and inside the mug you had something else like that you were having act like a liquid, or possibly like pencils or something that are standing up in the mug, and you're wanting to edit whatever's in the mug, that this can be really useful, especially if the objects or things you're trying to edit are close to the bottom. And then to switch back, you just hold down the Z button again and then hover over solid. Now, there's actually a cool little shortcut. So if you hold down Shift and just press Z, you'll automatically toggle between wireframe and whatever the last view you were in. So I'm just going to go to Material Preview for a sec. And this is just for example. Again, you don't have to worry about this too much right now. So Shift and Z, wireframe, and then Shift Z, and I go straight back to Material Preview. For us right now, we're pretty much just going to be toggling between wireframe and solid. But again, this will come up in some of the exercises, and it's definitely a useful tool to have in your tool belt. Before we get into objects, there's just one more thing that I want to talk about, and that is splitting and merging workspace views. So you can actually split this view window, and the way you do that is you come over here and you want your arrow or your cursor to turn into an arrow, like the type of arrow you use to resize the window. And so once you get that, you right click, and you can either do a vertical or horizontal, and vertical gives you just that, and horizontal gives you just that. So when you click that, it's kind of hard to see, but there's this line that's following around my cursor now. And so all you have to do is position that line in your cursor where you want it, and when you click, see, it splits the workspace. And there's not really a limit to how many times you can do this. For instance, we'll do another one. We'll do a horizontal split this time. So now we've got 3 different workspaces. Now, these are all linked. Like, this doesn't create extra objects, so anything I do to this object over here is going to happen to here and here. And you may be thinking, well, how is that useful? Well, you can, they're linked, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything you do over here is done here. So for example, if I move my view with numpad 1 to front here, you notice these didn't change. And likewise, if I come over here and I do 3, and come over here and do 7, and this one I have to kind of move the camera pan a little bit to get that back in the center, and same thing here, move this back in the center. So now I've actually got 3 different, I've got a view on each of my axes. And so for example, if you were trying to build a model out of a reference image or several reference images, this would be really useful, because now you can see when you grab like an edge or something to move it, you can see exactly how it's going to affect your mesh on every single axis. So it can be a time saver in some situations, especially if you're working on complex meshes. Now, to join these, it's just as easy. You just hover over until you get your little arrow again and right click. And you're just going to click the Join View option. You'll notice there's an arrow that'll show you what direction they're going to merge. And so, like, let's say the default it gave me was this. Let's say I wanted to merge up instead of down. I just hover over this, and there, now the view I had on top is gone, and now I'm left with the bottom. And then hover over here and do the same thing. And let's say I wanted this one, so this is going to merge right. And now I'm back to one view. So, now that we've talked about the camera, now that we've talked about viewports and everything, let's start talking about manipulating objects. And so you start out in Blender in object mode, and that is listed right here. For now, the two modes that we're going to be concerned with are object and edit. We're not going to get into edit in this video. We'll get into edit during the next one. For now, though, let's talk about how to add and remove objects. So let's say I don't want a cube. Let's say, I want a sphere or something. Well, there's two different ways to remove an object. So you can hit delete and it's gone. There's no confirmation or anything. It's just gone. And I'm going to press Control Z to undo what I just did. You can also come up here in this little menu and right click, and there's a delete option here as well. Again, I prefer to use the keyboard shortcuts because they're faster, but if you really like using this better, hey, power to you. The second way to delete things is by using the X key. So if you highlight an object and press X, you get this nice little box that says OK to delete. And I really prefer that option just because you get the confirmation, and that way if you do make a mistake or you hit it and then all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, I didn't want to do that, you at least have the chance to cancel out of it. So now I've successfully removed my my cube. So let's go ahead and add the sphere I was talking about earlier. To add objects, it's just Shift plus A. And this brings up a nice menu of all the different things you can add. So for now, we're just going to focus on meshes. Don't worry about any of these other things down here for now. We're going to talk about some of these things in later lessons, but for now, we're just concerned with meshes. And we're going to add a UV sphere. Now, there are two different types of spheres, and I'll show you both of those in just a sec. So this is a UV sphere. And you'll notice, I'm going to pan to make sure it's in the center. You'll notice for the most part, and it's more apparent if I go into wireframe, that it's made up of squares. Everything except for the tippy top of it. And then I'll go ahead and delete this really quick and add the icosphere just so you can see what that looks like. And you'll notice that this one is made of triangles. And again, Shift Z just so you can see that. Now, for the most part, we'll be using UV spheres just because, especially once we start getting into rigging and everything, the squares, also called quads, tend to work a little bit better than the tris, which are the triangles. One thing that's on both of these, though, that's equally important is you'll notice down here at the bottom, whenever you create any object, you get this little window here. And it's minimized by default, but if I click on it, it maximizes, and you'll notice that you have some settings. So for instance, here you've got a radius, and this will determine how big your sphere is, and then you've got subdivisions. Now this is the important one, and I'll show you the options on the UV sphere in a minute. But for the subdivisions, the more subdivisions you put, the smoother your object will look, but for instance, if we do Shift Z, man, you'll notice you've got a lot of triangles now, and that's your poly count. And the higher your poly count is, the more your computer is going to have to work to render things. Now, we have one object, so our computers probably aren't having to work too hard. But if you once you start getting into more complex models, you're really going to be wanting to watch your poly count and to try to, strike a balance between quality and performance. And there's a way you can cheat. So you don't need to do this just to get a circle or a sphere that looks like a sphere. And I'll show you that in a sec. Before I do that, let me go ahead and show you the UV sphere options like I said I would. So Shift A, and adding our UV sphere. Now, the UV sphere has segments, and the segments are the vertical lines on this sphere, and so if you take those down, it starts looking a little bit like a Chinese or Japanese lantern, and then your rings are your horizontal circles. And again, Like if you wanted a paper craft look or something, or like I said, like if you were actually making a Japanese lantern, this could be a really quick and dirty way to do it. But most of the time, we're wanting things that actually looks like spheres. And I mean, you can either use the arrows or you can just click on the number and you can put something in. So like if I crank this up really high, like 150, and then crank this up really high, like 50, again, you see you get a really smooth looking sphere. But if I shift Z again, yeah, I mean, look at how many squares are making up that thing. And again, same problem. That's a really high poly count. And so if you have a bigger mesh or you have a lot of different objects on the screen at once, your computer's really going to start sweating to render everything quickly. So let's talk about the way that I said you can cheat. So let me set that back to 32, and I believe the rings were at 16. Yeah, that looks right. So if you right click, you'll notice this option called Shade Smooth. And oh, look at that. You can kind of tell on the edges a little bit, but for the most part, it looks a lot better. And so this is kind of that balance I was talking about between quality and performance. I mean, there's ways you can kind of cheat and get something that looks fairly decent without having to put in a ridiculous number of triangles. And I won't go too in depth just because I feel like I'm already dumping a lot with key commands and everything on you. But all you need to know about the reason that Shade Smooth is different than Shade Flat is it kind of does some math under the hood to all these little squares to make them appear smooth. They're not really smooth. So for example, go Shade Smooth, and like if I go into Shift Z, see, I've still got my squares. It's just the camera's kind of doing some math to fake it. So that's a really useful trick, is the Shade Smooth, and we'll be using that quite a bit through our lessons. To kind of polish off the lesson, I want to talk about the big three operations. Before I do that, there are a couple of things I kind of forgot to talk about earlier, so I'll talk about them now. So one menu that we're not going to do much with now, but will come up in later lessons, I just kind of want to point out, is called the In menu, and I call it that because you press In to open it. And so I probably have a lot more options here than you guys have right now because I've got a bunch of plugins installed that do different things. You don't have to worry if yours looks different. You can just tap the In to close it. But definitely take note of the In menu and kind of how to access it because we are going to be using that quite frequently later in the lesson. And while I'm talking about taking note, I would strongly recommend that as you're going through these lessons, you kind of start building out a cheat sheet of key commands for Blender. If you guys would like, I could definitely share my cheat sheet, but that being said, it was really helpful whenever I was going through Blender lessons to just make my own cheat sheet. Something about the act of actually having to write things down and organize it in my own words really helped a lot of these things to stick. And so with that in mind, I think we can go ahead and talk about what I call the big three. And so the reason I call these the big three is because these are operations that are kind of used in every single mode we're going to talk about or close to it. So these are available in object mode and edit mode. They're available once you start doing texture editing and sculpting. And so these are also some of the more common operations you do when you're trying to manipulate your objects. So the first of these is grab, and you activate that with G. Use grab to reference G just because it's easier for me to remember, and so that lets you move things around. And so there are a couple of little tips you can use with this. So if you press X, Y, or Z, so the axis letters, it'll clamp movement along that axis. So see, now I can only move along the Y, X, and only on the Z. Now, if you hold down the Shift and press one of these things, it'll clamp movement to everything but that axis. So Shift Z lets me move on X and Y, but I can't move on Z. Shift X lets me move on Y and Z, but not on X. And Shift Y lets me move on X and Z, but not on Y. So again, this is something else that we're going to use quite frequently. So definitely kind of make a note that you can use X, Y, and Z and Shift X, Y, and Z to change the behavior of the grab. And so like if I move this up, and you can either use Enter or you can just left click to accept the operation. And now you notice I'm a little closer to the origin. So for example, if I do it again, so G and now Z, and move it up a lot, now you'll notice I'm no longer on that axis plane. Now I'm above where the origin point is. And so the second operation is rotate, or R. So again, just like G for grab, R for rotate. And as you can see, if I drag the mouse around, my object's rotating. And just like grab, you can use X, Y, and Z to clamp rotation. And so if we rotate around Z, you can't see it very well. If you kind of squint at the object, you can kind of see it moving. X and Y are much more apparent though. And that's just because the object's already kind of on the Z axis. And then same thing as the grab, like if I do Shift Z, I can rotate on X and Y, which again you can't really see very well. Let me do Shift Y, maybe Shift X. Yeah, I think it's the let me left click and kind of rotate. I think it's the view that I was at. So now R for rotate and Shift, we'll do Y. It's still not really apparent, but it does have the same behavior. It's just not really apparent with the operation I'm trying to do. And then the last of the big three is scale, and it's with S. So once again, and this one will be easy to see, so you can clamp that to a particular axis. So now I'm only scaling the Z-axis of the sphere, and X, I'm only scaling the X, and then Y, I'm only scaling Y. And then same thing, so this one is actually really handy, so Shift Z, and I'm now scaling everything but Z. And then same thing as the other two, like once you're happy with how it looks, you can either left click or press enter and go ahead and accept that. Okay, and so that is the basics on how to kind of interact with objects in Blender. Again, we're not going to really talk about edit mode, and this is really just a brief overview. You know, the next couple of lessons we're going to be spending far more time in edit mode than object mode, but I did want to give a brief overview, especially because a lot of the operations and things that I went over in this lesson will also translate or be available in edit mode. So again, this is just because I don't want to overwhelm you guys right off the bat. Definitely stay tuned for the next video. And I did kind of lie to you. I said that I would start exercises with this video, but there's a little bit more I want to show you guys, so it'll be next video. That's when the exercises will start. Until then, thank you very much for tuning into another video. I hope you enjoyed it, and please don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.